Amid the expansive northern wilderness Montana, where old trees converged, the morning air carried rough mountains. Thomas, a distinct type of tension walker, had been following creatures in these woods for more than 2 decades. But he couldn't have been prepared for what he was going to learn on this cold on a fall morning. The wilderness had consistently been his haven, a location where he recognized all of the wind's whispers and every minor alteration to the surroundings. However, something had changed recently. Something that made his experience even more instinctive. Hunters tense with doubt. The sun had just begun to rise. Above the tops of the mountains, throwing long through the tall pine trees, shadows a new layer of snow encased the earth, creating each movement and track simple to identify. For a skilled hunter, Thomas's haggard face was seen, the results of innumerable days spent in these forests. Yet his eyes stayed keen. An alert moved without missing anything. Quietly moving through the forest itself seems to contain ancient secrets. Heavy pines towed above their branches, snow forming a cathedral-like structure canopy that provided early morning filtering light. Thomas was familiar with every ridge and trail, every stream and clearing in these areas. He had benefited greatly from this knowledge over the years, establishing his standing as one among the most esteemed outdoor enthusiasts in the area. But now that same information made him very conscious that something was much different from his sweetheart. Thomas Wilderness had merited his knowledge of these mountains via means of years of endurance and OB monitoring. Every season had its own rhythms. He was able to read his own patterns. The movements of herds of deer are like a book. Tendencies of local wolf packs, hunting bears, seasonal behaviors. All of he was now as accustomed to these as his own hand's lines. Although recently weeks, those trends had started to shift in ways that were impossible to explain. To Thomas, the adjustments began slowly at first. Saw a change in the deer populations. Leaving their customary feeding grounds, the herds of elk, typically, they had started to move predictably, utilizing unconventional paths through the mountains. Even the tiniest animals, the squirrels and rabbits that typically suddenly appeared to be dispersed upon his approach, vanished long before he approached, as though there was a bigger danger in these woods. Typically, morning birds are vocal with their dawn chorus had become more subdued. Their song is more hesitant and shorter. The carrying scent of the air appeared to change. Thomas felt his skin tingle with awareness of all these mountains that he was familiar with. In addition to his own house, felt slightly different, although important ways that something amazing, something was going on in these woods. Thomas, that would put everything to the test, believed he was knowledgeable about nature. News of the strange events in the wilderness swiftly expanded throughout. The local ranchers in a small mountain community were the initial ones to voice their concerns at the monthly gathering of the town. At the old, their tales in the community hall painted an image that became increasingly enigmatic with every day, fostering a feeling of discomfort that affected everyone in the Bill Henderson, a valley elder who had lived on the ranch owned by his family for more than 60 years. Mentioned hearing odd sounds at night. These were not the well-known cries of the everyone's local wolf groups had expanded. Those who were used to these noises were a variety of deep, guttural grunts, loud cries that disturbed his cattle. Even his livestock is frightened by his horses. Normally quiet, even during storm STS during this time, gathered in their enclosures, their terrified eyes at something. Sarah Matthews, invisible in the shadows, whose land was adjacent to the national woodland, reported discovering footprints in the snow that was different from anything she had observed during her 30 years. Of the prints were confusing for ranching. A combination of what appeared to be wolf tracks next to something considerably bigger, but they moved in tandem in ways that didn't make sense to meet woodsmen and their dogs. Typically willing to follow any animal, declined to follow these tucking trails. When prodded, their tails and whining, the Forest Service had dismissed the forward. Their apprehensions regarding the unique reaction to wildlife's natural changes, trends brought on by climate change. But Native American elders in the area from it was peaceful on the neighboring reservation. When questioned about the modifications, there to those who were silent, silence spoke volumes. recognized their close ties to some of the more senior tribal members murmured about old tales. Tales of moments when everything is in its natural order might change in surprising ways. Including the most skeptics in the community started to pay attention as hunting turned into more challenging. Seasoned hunters returned with nothing from regions that had consistently offered dependable games. They mentioned a spooky quiet in the forest, of spotting odd tracks, and of sensing observed by an invisible entity. The wildlife photographers in the area, who typically took stunning pictures of elk, bears, and wolves, have now returned with memory cards that are empty at the neighborhood diner, while sipping strong coffee. Drinkers discuss some of their theories. Thought a new predator had entered the region that is upsetting the natural order. Others made more amazing suggestions. Explanations based on legends from the past and tales handed down over the generations. However, everyone concurred that something extraordinary was taking place in their mountains. The community's stress increased every week. Ranchers started bringing in their livestock earlier. Parents became more guardians of the wilderness, and their kids that has served as their residents for many years seemed unfamiliar and suddenly filled with secrets that Thomas couldn't comprehend. His mind was awake long before sunrise, already concentrated on the work at hand. That the temperature had drastically decreased overnight, producing flawless tracking. Faced with a new layer of snow, he went about his morning duties gathered the equipment and worked efficiently. The night before today, he had made preparations. Wasn't about traditional hunting, since today was all about getting solutions. His vintage pickup bounced down the deteriorated Forest Service road before sunrise. Headlights in the dark piercing. The Thomas had selected his beginning point with meticulous planning to start his search at a location where numerous ranchers had reported strange. Luckily, he had his reliable weapon with him, more out of custom and deference to the more wilderness than any plan to utilize it. His camera binoculars were in his rucksack. Additional clothing layers and adequate provisions to last the day if required. The shadows started to fade as his truck was parked at the end of the cool air on the service road made every breath hurts his lungs. But the ache seemed comfortable, almost welcoming. Thomas tightened his grip on his wool cap and made adjustments to his bag, pausing to examine the terrain in front of him. The wide forest was still, and the new snow forming a blank canvas that would indicate any motion or action. He began his journey steadily. As the sound of boots crunching in the new snow, he had learned from years of experience how to move silently despite these circumstances. He stopped to listen every few minutes and take note of how the forest seems. Slight differences from the norm. The sounds of morning were muffled, as though the animals were holding their breath, including the pine branches being blown by the wind. Seems to have a distinct tone. Thomas took a path that would lead him to past a number of locations where there were reports of tracks. So he maintained his eyes on the ground, taking note of each. His trained sight disturbed the snow, able to differentiate between normal movements of animals and anything from, as the morning light intensified as he penetrated the wilderness further, displaying additional landscape details surrounding him. Following an hour of cautious advancement, he arrived to a ridge line that provided a perspective of the valley. Here, Thomas stopped and took off his binoculars to examine. The sun's surface had risen to the point that the snow was illuminated. Covered hillsides that produce a scene of light and shadow. As seen from this angle, he noticed a number of wildlife paths that met in the valley below, assuming there was strange activity in these forests. Those trails would probably provide proof of it. The initial indication showed up as the sun's rays in the morning completely cleaned. The Thomas saw high peaks and a disruption in the snow close to the foot of an old pine tree that caused him to stop. He bent over to take a closer look, his seasoned eyes absorbing each. The track's level of detail was different here. Anything he had witnessed during his 2 decades of tracking and hunting in these mountains. There were obvious wolf prints in the new snow. However, they were combined with another big, hefty track that might only be a bear's. Yet the Thomas understood bears, but the pattern was incorrect. Ought to be getting ready for hibernation at their movements during this time of year, usually alone and slow. Yet the bear's tracks revealed a different tale. Prints followed the wolf's footprints, not in a chase's disorganized pattern or battle, but in what looked like a CO. Thomas made a concerted motion and pulled out his camera meticulously, taking pictures of the odd tracks taken from various perspectives. He positioned his hand near to a bear prints to show the size of his big hand. The enormous paw print that dwarfs the depth of the snow impressions proposed a remarkable animal size. But the wolf's footprints were what they showed no indications, which really baffled him, of hostility or fear. No sign of the connection that is naturally antagonistic the relationship between wolves and bears. As he proceeded down the trail, broken branches were visible as proof. High on the trees revealed indications of anything big going through, while the snow was closer to the ground. Disturbed by trends that indicated coordinated motion between several of the trails of the creatures led further into a section of the woodland where local hunters usually stayed away from a densely populated steep terrain and foliage. The air had been unusually quiet in the morning, generating a spooky quiet that made every tiny sound seems to be amplified. Thomas's intuition, developed over decades in the wilderness, was warning. He discovered indications he couldn't ignore. Himself taking more care to check his environment, more often the forest surrounding him felt electric, with a vitality he had never known prior to approaching a tiny clearing. He found more convincing proof that remnants of a recent murder revealed evidence of both naked feeding and wolves, but not in the prey's typical competitive manner, been supplied with unmistakable indications that the predators had engaged in this behavior. Disregarded all of Thomas's knowledge of wild, he recorded interactions between animals. Things carefully, understanding that what he was seeing might be. Once Thomas started adhering to the odd tracks with elevated consciousness of his years of experience, directing each cautious step, that the trail took him farther into the wilderness in the direction of a section of the forest where hardly many people ever traveled to the area. The terrain became more difficult, with steep inclines and dense vegetation that would discourage most hunters, but there was no indication of hesitating, and deliberately passing through the challenging terrain of the morning had gradually warmed, resulting in tiny drips of snow melts and falls from the branches, produced tiny echoes above each drop, and Thomas moved the unnaturally quiet air, gradually recording everything with as the footage from the webcam revealed a tale that becoming increasingly intriguing with each. The wolf group that he was traveling by, thought to be at least 8 based on the prints, moved in the ideal collaboration with the bears. Enormous monitoring their movements revealed no indications of the innate hostility or dread that ought to coexist with these animals. Since Thomas ascended farther into the mountains, observed other alterations in the forest. The typical trails for small game had been abandoned, lacking a recent deer or rabbit tracks. Even the bird crossing his path appeared to be lacking in their morning melodies, replaced by a spooky quiet throughout. The forest seemed to be keeping its hold on while you wait for something important to occur, and the air conveyed strange smells that caused the hair to stand on. After that, the back of his neck stood up. Thomas was meticulously tracked for several hours. Discovered himself in a section of the woodland where he had not often been. To these trees, which were, as they age, their enormous trunks are covered in thick moss shafts that filter sunlight in peculiar patterns through the canopy, generating shadow and light patterns. It appeared to move with their own life. The paths he followed turned into fresher snow with less disruptions. Whatever he was tracking recently had traveled through this region in the previous. Thomas took a few hours to check his GPS unit, indicating helpful waypoints if necessary. He had to go back the way he had traveled, around 5 miles away from his beginning point, and gradually increasing in elevation. The air had become more vaporized, increasing the deliberateness of each breath. But the altitude alone wasn't what caused respiratory problems. There was a noticeable tension in the atmosphere, a sense of growing expectation, stronger with every advance. The tracking conditions were superb, with the newly fallen snow exposing each motion of the creatures he pursued. What particularly surprised Thomas was how purposeful the trail showed, that these weren't just any wanderings of woodland animals at the bar. Suddenly, there were wolves moving with obvious, purposefully moving in the direction of something as he climbed another ridge that Thomas had captured. view of a natural clearing in front of the tracks went straight to it, and he had a gut feeling that this was where he would discover the solutions to the enigma that had developed over several weeks. Thomas made his way to the clearing with the extreme care, his heart thumping not from effort, but out of expectation. He discovered a spot behind a fallen log that provided cover as well as a good perspective of the region in front of the natural. A clearing in the shape of a bowl extended before him. Encircled by tall pines and morning rock cliffs coated in snow, the room was now completely lighted by sunshine, establishing ideal visibility throughout the whole space. As he became comfortable in his point, Thomas is being closely observed. He set up his gear so that his camera lay ready for easy access on the log while he kept his binoculars firm in his hands. The clearing beneath displayed indications of a lot of tracks and recent activity cutting through the new snow, but it was what arose out of the shadows that created. Thomas fails to inhale. A big gray, the wolf, initially emerged, moving with confidently enters the clearing. The behavior was quickly deemed out of the ordinary. None of the usual care was present that defined the migration of wolves in open. More wolves appeared in the spaces behind it. Their fur from the tree line, a combination of their movements, are dark and gray, coordinated in a manner that suggested a Thomas, a reputable pack, counted them in silence for 8, 10, and 12. All of the wolves are moving in unison. Odd assurance, but it was what arrived, then caused Thomas's hands to shake as his camera was raised from the same direction. A bear appeared as the wolves, unbelievably large. Its fur was a deep, some areas are brown, nearly black, and its actions demonstrated strength, and in the bear was bigger than imagined grace. More than any previous grizzly Thomas came across during his decades of expertise, its enormous body, creating a shadow through the snow, as it entered the what transpired next defied sunlight. All of Thomas's knowledge of wildlife actions, rather than the violent conflict that ought to have broken out, the bear wandered between natural enemies. As though it were a member of the wolf, there was no dread among the wolves in their pack. No hostility. Some even seemed to respect the bear's presence by establishing a societal dynamic that broke all recognized predator interaction. Principal Thomas marveled as he watched in the wild. As wolves and the bar moved in tandem through their movements in the clearing, arranged in a manner that implied this was not a fortuitous meeting, but enforged a connection. The bear appeared to speak with the wolves by using nonverbal clues, and the wolves reciprocated by saying that they were cooperating, sharing space, and displaying social actions that would transform scientific knowledge of encounters with wildlife. In the morning, the vapor from their breath was captured by the light as they moved in the chilly air, producing an almost legendary aspect to the scene. Thomas kept a record of everything using his camera. His hands are now more steady as he caught what he anticipated being footage of historical significance. The bear grew much larger, evident when it momentarily stood on its. The wolf's hind legs are tall. Friends without displaying any hostility, the wolves then moved in their direction, surrounding the bear in a way that mentioned their pack's long-standing association. Formation changing to incorporate this improbable. For the next 2 hours, Ally Thomas did not move behind his fallen logs that record the most. He exhibited remarkable wildlife behavior. Ever observed the exchange between a complex was uncovered by the bar and wolf pack societal framework that would all of the current theories around predator partnerships in the wild at every time revealed fresh information that left Thomas unable to fully understand the scope of what he observed the wolves possessed. They arranged themselves in a way that featured the bear as the main character. The alpha pair of the pack is identified by their assured demeanor, and the respect displayed by other pack members appear to share leadership with the enormous grizzly. When the dominant male went to look into anything, the bear followed the clearing edge and younger wolves formed up. This cooperative is behind them both. In some respects, hierarchy violated natural order. That would leave wildlife specialist Thomas unable to speak, watched as they conveyed using an advanced. The bear's body language system would raise its head in a specific manner, and the wolves would react by dispersing. In the position of a hunt, when one of the wolves growled low, the bear would shift its focus in that direction. demonstrating a degree of interspecies comprehension that has never been recorded before. Their motions were so well coordinated that seemed to have been collaborating. The clearing itself for generations demonstrated proof of their success. Collaboration on its periphery. Thomas observed the remnants of a number of recent eliminates the dietary habits that are apparent, and instead, a magnificent story was told by the snow, a vying for the bear's prey, and it was evident that wolves had shared their kills. Several carcasses displayed indications of hunting cooperatively while carrying a wound that only both could have caused it. Species collaborating together. This collaboration had progressed beyond just tolerance into a real hunting experience. As the morning wore on, Alliance Thomas saw their method of hunting. A tiny herd of elk appeared in action near the clearing's far end, and with practice, the Bee-Wolf Alliance moved. With accuracy, the wolves dispersed in their conventional hunting arrangement, but with an important distinction in the bear's position strategically, and by utilizing its enormous presence to aid in directing the prey. The elk headed toward the members of the waiting herd. Perplexed by this extraordinary, a group of predators entered chaos. But Thomas was unable to observe the actual hunt from his vantage point. To the group's synchronized departure, they have a clear tactical advantage. The social bonding was the most noteworthy. Thomas noted during the quiet periods the bear would be surrounded by juvenile wolves, displaying none of the appropriate dread exists between these species. The bear showed an unexpected tenderness in these interactions. Vast scope and power is well restrained at one moment. Everyone in the group took a collective nap. The bear was encircled in the morning sun. Through wolves in an area that seemed more akin to a family portrait than an event of natural adversaries. During his, Thomas made the remark that their combined presence had changed everything. Ecology of the clearings. Other creatures that came close swiftly withdrew. Seems ill-prepared for this new high predatory alliance. The air self appeared imbued with the importance of what was taking place, as though nature herself was recognizing this advancement in behavior of predators. Every action, every communication, during every minute spent together between the wolves and bear, described an adaptability that would compel scientists to considering all that is known about cooperation between wildlife and the bear and wolf. Eventually, the pack shifted away from the clearing that vanishes into the thick forest. Thomas held onto his job. For a few extended moments, his hands shuddered a little when he went over that his camera had hundreds of pictures. Every picture offers indisputable proof of something that would have been written off as impossible within hours prior to the discovery in the morning. Would not only alter our knowledge of science, but would also serve as a reminder to mankind that there were still mysteries in the natural world, able to render us incomprehensible. I was surprised that the sun had risen so high in the sky when Thomas eventually started his return to civilization, and his thoughts raced with the consequences of his had observed the odd sounds that the ranchers were concerned about, the odd songs with odd experiences, outdoor enthusiasts, and the unspoken knowledge of the elders of Native American descent who had perceived all of these. Adjustments suddenly made perfect sense. His documentation included more than it was just an odd animal behavior. Proof of the extraordinary power of nature to change and develop partnerships, something seems unfeasible by traditional knowledge. As he returned through, Thomas observed in the jungle how he heard every sound differently now. In motion in the wilderness surrounding him that has served as his residence for a long time, had exposed an additional level of intricacy. The paths he had pursued that had appeared so enigmatic that morning told a convincing tale of collaboration, and he meticulously charted his route for adaptation on his GPS, aware that researchers might soon wish to investigate this field and describe the ramifications of this. Findings would extend well beyond it would challenge the scientific community. Basic presumptions regarding animals' social structures and intelligence that Thomas carried pictures and video would serve as the basis for new studies on the behavior of wildlife that lead to innovative research in animal collaboration. Intelligence, the bear, and wolves had shown evidence of social adaptation that would compel people to re-evaluate their comprehension of wildlife's awareness and capacity. When Thomas arrived at his truck, Long was being cast by the midday sun. Through the tree shadows, he fastened his equipment with caution, understanding that each picture, that each video clip would be examined by specialists worldwide. The neighborhood would soon comprehend the events that had been taking on throughout their mountains. But Thomas was aware of this. The discovery was not limited to it would be included into their small town. Humanity's increasing comprehension of the limitless potential of the natural environment, too, as he drove back down. He was surprised and adjusted. Thomas considered the Forest Service road. Regarding the potential changes brought about by this discovery, sources from which scholars would worldwide to research this collaboration in conservation, it would be necessary to modify efforts to safeguard this special connection that the Forest Service would have to create fresh rules for an ecosystem that is currently contained this exceptional predator. Alliance, but above all, this finding would serve as a reminder that there were still mysteries in the natural world, had the ability to silence us. With its capacity to surpass our poor comprehension of what was potentially contribute to our expanding narrative community on YouTube by listening to stories that change after selecting subscribe, press notification. Bell will receive weekly updates that question our assumptions about the remarkable moments in life.